This conversation on modern representative democracy is part of a EU Horizon Redirect project. It is based on a workshop we organized in February 2024 with Professors Céline Spector and Nadia Urbinati. This recording is a native version of the answers they gave during that workshop. Let's start with our first question. What is your understanding of modern representative democracy as a form of government, particularly of its inner tension between representation as a more elitist form of government and democracy as based on a more popular idea of ruling?
So yes, I think you're perfectly right. So the understanding of representative democracy was at the beginning, from the start, torn between two rival conceptions, depending on how much power was actually given to the citizens to deliberate and control their representatives, and also depending whether representation was considered as a substitute for participation. So, for instance, if you take the levelers, they were clearly committed to extended suffrage, equality before the law, free speech and ballot. So, for instance, Lilburn, Overton, and their colleagues, they clearly had a democratic account of representation. The people had to be represented in the House of Commons. And also, if you look, for instance, at the real Whigs in 17th century England, who actually were associated with Dutch radicals and also with the French Huguenots, so it was really a European phenomenon, they were all in favor of representing the people versus, of course, the grandees, the nobles in the House of Lords. So I think Nadia has also very much insisted on this point that Republican leaders deemed representation an unavoidable condition for both political liberty and moderate government. So, for instance, I will quote Sidney, because Sidney is maybe less famous than the others. So Sidney's discourses concerning government. So I quote Sidney: "The legislative power, therefore, that is exercised by the parliament must be essentially and radically in the people, from whom their delegates and representatives have all that they have." So Sidney really insisted that the sovereign and the MPs were both servants. He uses this word, servants, in public affairs, so that under certain conditions, representation was actually a kind of identification. What you called precisely, Dario, the politics of presence, grounded on formal consent. So according to Sidney, I quote him again: "The liberty of those who act in their own persons and of those who send delegates is perfectly the same. It's the same kind of freedom. And the exercise is and can only be changed by their consent." So for Sidney, it's very clearly in this Republican tradition, there is no aristocratic dimension within representation. I think that will clearly appear more around the Tories, around Bolingbroke, and the Viscount Bolingbroke had a very, very huge influence on Montesquieu. So I will just say a word about Montesquieu, probably leaving to Nadia to talk about maybe the American debate. Montesquieu defended, of course, a more hybrid or mixed view of representation, unlike the English Republicans that Skinner had studied. So for Montesquieu, clearly lottery was democratic, but election was aristocratic, and the people only knew how to select their representatives. So what Montesquieu said, I quote, is: "The great advantage of representatives is their capacity of discussing public affairs. For this, the people collectively are extremely unfit, which is one of the chief inconveniences of a democracy." So basically, modern representation in England, for instance, is totally opposed to classical democracy and direct democracy. But finally, I want to insist that Montesquieu was not only on the aristocratical side of representation, because he also had a democratic view, a democratic account of representation when he said, I quote, "As in a country of liberty, every man who is supposed a free agent ought to be his own governor. So basically, the idea is that anyone who has a free soul, une âme libre, should be self-governed. But it's only because of, let's say, scale reasons that actually we need representatives. So even in Montesquieu, actually, who is usually thought as a liberal, Montesquieu actually was very much influenced by Sidney's theory of representation. The two only philosophers who are quoted in his famous book on England are Harrington and Sidney. And I think that is very much, I mean, we have to take it into account. And I think that Montesquieu scholar didn't work enough on Montesquieu's connection to the English Republicans. Yeah, so I will stop here, maybe leave it to Nadia for the rest.
So just to continue, I'd like simply to introduce an element that I thought a lot about these months while I was working on lottery. Now, these levelers, you refer to the levelers, you refer to the democratic moment of the beginning of representation in the English Revolution. It is very interesting that this was connected to the conceptions or to an articulation of the conception of natural law tradition, meaning the fact that the people is the depository of the legitimacy, and nobody can substitute it or supplant it. Otherwise, is the tyrant, is the seditious domination that needs to be eradicated, either by revolution or by rebellion. So even in the St. Thomas tradition, in the medieval tradition, there is this split between the foundations or the source of sovereignty and the exercise of, and thus, not by chance, representation made disappearance in the domain, in the church, and then in the medieval disputations between sovereign and administrators or administrators of sovereignty. So having said so, let's continue this problem, which for me is very interesting. When the disconnections between democracy and representation strongly imposed itself. The Céline already introduced this argument. I found extremely important. As Céline mentioned, of course, Montesquieu. And I would say that following the suggestion by Montesquieu, we have something new here, because in Montesquieu, it's not simply representation the issue, but it's election. For the first time, elections is identified with something that is not democratic. This was very unique, because it was as if democracy meant a form of selection that was completely different from the other forms that we use today, which is the argument by Bernard Manin. Bernard Manin reoperated these arguments in the 20th century and saying, look, it's not true. Of course, Manin had another target against which to write, meaning the target was participatory Democrats who disconnected democracy with representation. And he connected democracy through representation by claiming that democracy allows for forms of selection. What is thus the difference? It's not representation, but the kind of selection. What kind of selection? So democracy has a selections by choice, by chance, and instead aristocracy has a selection by choice. And this dualism, which was intentionally used in order to make a claim against participatory Democrats, and in order to reactivate representation within democracy, it backfired, in my view. It backfired because from that moment on, particularly more recently, the issue of election becomes the real object of contestation. So we can have different forms of representations, we can have different forms of even selections, but is elections a problem? So I find this an important issue. In my view, at least, it is one important issue that can find an interest, an interesting, I don't know, but can find a way to go even in non-democratic critics of representative democracy. You know, if you think about Carl Schmitt, he picked up from Montesquieu, exactly like indicated to Bernard Manin where to go, because Bernard Manin goes to Montesquieu and to Schmitt. The idea is that election is a way of limiting the power of the absolute king or the absolute sovereign. If you want to have a sovereign thus, you don't want to have this kind of limitation. Thus, the idea is to create a different form of sovereignty that doesn't need to pass through elections. If you enter in the domain of elections, you are already outside of the sovereign absolute or unified. You are within a kind of sovereign that is completely liberalized, the liberal sovereign, that for him meant no politics at all. So once again, elections is the source of the problem, even more than representation. So representation in the 20th century comes back in the 90s. Of course, Anne Pitkin wrote the book in 1967, but it was a silent book for many years after she wrote the book. It came back to democracy representation, not through elections in this case, in the 90s, along with the debates over multiculturalism, group diversities, and the solution to the problem of the abstract individual citizen, how to adjust these abstract individual citizens to a society that is made of plurality of aggregations and diversities. In this case, if you read books by Lani Guinier, by Irish Young, by Melissa Williams, the issue becomes, once again, representation can be operationalized in democracy, actually is the best way to adjust this issue of the abstract citizen with the concrete diversity kind of citizens we are in relation to gender and to marginalized groups and so on and so forth. So the trajectory of representation does from the beginning that Céline was so brilliantly good in shaping, starting with the levelers, it comes back today in reaction perhaps also to the hyper-electoralizations of the theory of democracy that we had in the 50s and the 60s with the Schumpeterian tradition. It was a way of reactivating the democracy within society, and thus to somehow to have a second round of democratizations, a refounding democratization of representation in relation to this pluralization of society, or the pluralism of the social pluralism of the citizenry.